Hey, everybody. We are talking about the collapse of the old order. Now, what does that actually mean? We're going to be talking about World War II, of course, but we're also going to talk about the rise of the Soviet Union under Stalin, as well as the rise of China, first under Chiang Kai shek and then under Mao. So, the Stalin Revolution. One of the first things Joseph Stalin does is begins to expand the area that he's taken over. And as you can see, this line over here, annexed by the Soviet Union between 1939 and 1940. And after Lenin's death and Trotsky's banishment, Stalin rose to become the leader of a communist party. And his humble beginnings really helped him. He was the son of a poor shoemaker, but he became a very skillful administrator. He set about the task of industrializing the Soviet Union in such a way as to increase the power of the Communist Party domestically and increase the power of the Soviet Union in relations to other countries. And again, obviously, one of the ways he does that is to annex these areas. He had a 5-year plan, as do most people, but his was quite different. In addition to his 5-year plan, he also vowed to collectivize agriculture. And beginning in October of 1928, Stalin devised a series of 5-year plans that were designed to achieve some rather ambitious goals. And the way he went about this was to institutionalize and centralize state control over the economy. Under the 5-year plan, the Soviet Union actually did achieve rapid industrialization. This was accompanied by the kind of environmental change that was experienced by the US and Canada during their period of industrialization several decades earlier. And in the US and Canada, these environmental changes took place over decades, well, a couple of decades anyway. And in the Soviet Union, this takes place within 5 years. That is how quickly they industrialize, and that is the environmental impact. The Soviet Union squeezed the peasantry to pay for the massive investments required by the 5-year plan and to provide the necessary labor and food supplies required by the new industrial workers. The way the Soviet Union did this was to consolidate small farms into a vast collective. And these people were expected to supply the government with a fixed amount of food and distribute what was left among their own members. And this is actually what Mao will do in the Great Leap Forward in China. And we'll talk about that in next week's podcast. Collectivization was an attempt to organize the peasants into an industrial way of life and to bring them and food supplies firmly under the control of the government. Collectivization was accomplished by the violent suppression of the better off peasants, and they were called the kulaks, and distributed agricultural production so badly. Guys, here's the thing about the production, it failed. Soil rotation was not good. The skill level was not there. And about 5 million people died after the bad harvest in 1933 and 1934. The second 5-year plan, which went from 1933 to 1937, was originally intended to produce consumer goods, but fear of the Nazi regime in Germany prompted Stalin to shift the emphasis to heavy industries and armaments. Consumer goods became scarce and food became rationed. And keep in mind, guys, if you want to keep the masses happy, you have to feed them. This is going to become a problem. And that's what will bring about the gulags. Stalin's policies of industrialization and collectivization could only be carried out by threats and by force. To prevent any possible resistance or rebellion, Stalin used a secret police, the NKVD, to create a climate of terror that extended from intellectuals and upper levels of the party all the way down to ordinary Soviet citizens. Many Soviet citizens supported Stalin's regime in spite of fear and hardships. He created opportunities for women. And this was the first time that in Russia turned Soviet Union, women in the masses had the opportunity to join the workforce, to leave their home, to work in the government, to work for other places. But in return, for obedient, unquestioning people, they were able to rise within the ranks of the Communist Party, the military, the government, or their professions. But for questioning people, not as obedient as they could be, this is where you have the gulags. And these were concentration camps that were located in Siberia. Generally, if you went to one of these, you were never seen again. And how Stalin would let you know that you were at risk for being sent to a gulag is he would have these massive parties and you would be invited. And if you managed to entertain Stalin, flatter him enough, impress him, you got to go home. And if you didn't, you went off to the gulags. And if you didn't show up, people would find you and take you to the gulags. Yeah. Stalin's brutal methods helped the Soviet Union to industrialize faster than any country had ever done. In the late 1930s, the contrast between the economic strength of the Soviet Union and the depression troubles of the capitalist nations gave many the impression that Stalin's planned economy was a success. And if you just look at it from the economic standpoint, okay. If you look at the ways he did it, if you look at the fact that he completely broke his people, if you look at the millions that died under his regime, then we would say no. The Spanish Civil War. Ironically enough, guys, this was not in your textbook. I don't understand why. You need to know this. Maybe it's more of an AP Euro thing, but you should still know this. In 1931, Spanish King Alfonso XIII authorized elections to decide if the government of Spain wanted to change, if it wanted to alter, if the people wanted to make bold new steps, and they did. Voters overwhelmingly chose to abolish the monarchy in favor of a liberal republic, and Alfonso went into exile, and the Second Republic came to be. Initially dominated by middle-class liberals and moderate socialists, that would change because during the first 2 years of the Republic, organized labor and leftist radicals forced widespread liberal reforms, and the independence-minded region of Catalonia and the Basque provinces achieved virtual autonomy. Catalonia has had an active desire for autonomy since this time, and then total independence from Spain since 2005. And there have been a number of referendums and voting to actually break away and form their own country. The landed aristocracy, the church, and the large military clique opposed the Republic, and in November of 1933, conservative forces regained control of the government and elections. In response, socialists launched a revolution in the mining districts of Asturias, and Catalan nationalists rebelled in Barcelona. General Franco crushed the so-called October Revolution on behalf of the conservative government, and in 1935, he was appointed Army Chief of Staff. In February of 1936, new elections brought the Popular Front, a leftist coalition, to power, and Franco, who was a strict monarchist, was sent to an obscure command in the Canary Islands off Africa. Fearing that the liberal government would give way to Marxist revolutions, army officers conspired to seize power. And after a brief period of hesitation, Franco agreed to join the military conspiracy, which was scheduled to begin in Morocco at 5 a.m. on July 18th, and then in Spain 24 hours later. The difference in time was to allow the Army of Africa time to secure Morocco before being transported to Spain's Andalusian coast by the Navy. On July 18th, Spanish garrisons rose up in revolt all across Spain. Workers and peasants fought the uprising, but in many cities, the Republican government denied them weapons, and the nationalists soon gained control. In conservative regions such as Old Castile and Navarre, the nationalists seized control with little bloodshed. But in other regions, such as the fiercely independent city of Bilbao, they didn't dare leave their garrisons. And the nationalist revolt in the Spanish Navy largely failed. Warships run by committees of sailors were instrumental in securing a number of coastal cities for the Republic. Nevertheless, Franco managed to ferry his army of Africa over from Morocco, and during the next few months, nationalist forces rapidly overran much of the Republican-controlled areas in central and northern Spain. Madrid was put under siege in November. During 1937, Franco unified the nationalist forces under the command of the Falange, Spain's fascist party, while the Republicans fell under the sway of the communists. Germany and Italy aided Franco with an abundance of planes, tanks, and arms, while the Soviet Union aided the Republican side. In addition, thousands of communists and other radicals from France, the USSR, America, and elsewhere formed the international brigades to aid the Republican cause. The most significant contribution of these foreign units was the successful defense of Madrid until the end of the war. In June of 1938, nationalists drove to the Mediterranean Sea and cut Republican territory in two. Later in the year, Franco mounted a major offensive against Catalonia. In January 1939, its capital, Barcelona, was captured, and soon after, the rest of Catalonia fell. With the Republican cause all but lost, its leaders attempted to negotiate a peace, but Franco refused. On March 28, 1939, the Republicans finally surrendered Madrid, bringing the Spanish Civil War to an end. Up to 1 million lives were lost in this conflict, the most devastating in Spanish history. Franco subsequently served as dictator of Spain until his death in 1975. And that brings us, not there, but to Guernica. And Guernica is probably Picasso's most famous work. It's definitely a very powerful political statement. And Picasso painted this as an immediate reaction to the Nazis' devastating casual bombing practice on the Basque town of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. And guys, this is another example of what total war is. This is when you deliberately target civilians to try and end a war. Guernica shows the tragedies of war and the suffering it inflicts upon individuals, particularly innocent civilians. Again, total war. The work has gained quite a monumental status, becoming a perpetual reminder of the tragedies of war, an anti-war symbol, and the embodiment of peace. And this is on display. You can go see it. And if you ever have time, go to Malaga in Spain, and you can actually see the Picasso Museum where he grew up. Well, not grew up, but where he grew as an artist, I should say. And you can check it out. He did spend quite a bit of time eventually in Paris, traveling around Europe. But this is one of his more famous pieces. Moving on, we're going to talk about the rise of fascism and then the road to war before we end for today. In post-war Italy, thousands upon thousands of unemployed veterans and violent youth banded together in Fasciste de Convimento, and I'm sorry, I do not speak Italian, to demand action, to intimidate the politicians, and to serve as a strong-arm men for factory and property owners. They want change. The country is in an economic depression. These are the men who are being most impacted by it. Benito Mussolini became leader of the Fascist Party. And by 1921, this party had 300,000 members. You have to keep in mind that after World War I, people were terrified about another global conflict and would do pretty much anything to avoid such a conflict. When Mussolini threatened to use the Fascist Party to march on Rome unless he was appointed prime minister, the government immediately agreed. They wanted to avoid death and destruction, and that is exactly what Mussolini brought. While in power, Mussolini installed Fascist Party members in all government jobs and crushed all sources of opposition. Mussolini and the fascist movement excelled at propaganda and glorified war, but his foreign policy was cautious. The Italian fascist movement was imitated by people in most European countries, Latin America, China, and Japan. That brings us to Hitler. Germany had been hit hard by its defeat in World War I, the hyperinflation of 1923, and the Depression. Germans blamed socialists, Jews, and foreigners for their trouble. And what you have to understand about the German economy is that because Germany was wealthier than the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because they were able to supply men, money, weapons, technology, and because of the Schlieffen Plan, in which Germany invaded a neutral country, in that case it was Belgium, they are going to take the fall for World War I. And the question that I always ask everybody when discussing World War II is, do you think Hitler would have been able to rise to power the way he did had Germany not had to have taken such a fiscal responsibility for World War I? That's the question to ponder, guys. Adolf Hitler was an Austrian-born German army veteran who actually went blind in World War I because of chemical warfare, but he regained his vision. He became the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, aka the Nazis, and led them in an unsuccessful uprising in Munich in 1924. In 1925, while he was in prison, He wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in which he laid forth his racial theories, his aspirations for the German nation, and his proposal to overcome all inferior races, including the Jews. It is the ravings of a lunatic. A lot of bookstores do carry it for historical purposes, but there are people out there who actually believe in what he wrote. They're still there. They're called neo-Nazis. And a lot of these people also believe the Holocaust never happened. We'll talk about that later. When the Depression hit Germany, the Nazis gained support from the unemployed and from property owners. Basically, the people who had felt they had been forgotten, people who felt they had been left behind, or who had been specifically targeted by war reparations that Germany had to make. And he gave them a voice. Hitler assumed the post of chancellor in March of 1933 and proceeded to assume the power of a dictator. He declared himself the Führer of the Third Reich in August of 1934. The Nazis' economic and social policies were spectacularly effective. Public works contracts, a military buildup, which, by the way, that violated the Treaty of Versailles, and a policy of encouraging women to leave the workplace to release jobs for men led to an economic boom, low unemployment, and rising standards of living. So you can actually compare what Hitler did for the German economy to what Joseph Stalin did for the USSR economy. However, both of them will be responsible for the deaths of millions of people. All of this leads to war. To pursue his goal of territorial conquest, Hitler built up his armed forces and tested the reactions of other powers by withdrawing from the League of Nations, introducing conscription, or drafting men into the military, being active in trying to get men to join the military, and establishing an air force. And guys, all of these are in violation of the Treaty of Versailles from World War I. And again, like I mentioned before, keep in mind the entire world is like, yeah, we don't ever want to do this again. We never ever. Oh my God, there's a spider on my monitor. Die. Oh, thank goodness. Sorry, guys. That was incredibly horrifying. As I was saying, the rest of the world was terrified about having to go back to war. And because of that, they let it go. Hitler is doing all of these things that violate the Treaty of Versailles, and they let it go. And by letting it go, he's able to continue testing the waters. How far can he go? Italy invades Ethiopia in 1935. Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland in 1936. And Hitler and Mussolini's actions met with no serious objections from France, Britain, or the US. And that just emboldened Hitler. Hey, no one's stopping me. I'm going to keep going. And that's why he was able to invade Austria in 1938. And then he demanded the German-speaking portions of Czechoslovakia. And the leaders of France, Britain, and Italy all said okay. They agreed on this in the Munich Conference of September 1938. It's fine. Go ahead. Don't worry about it. Unfortunately, he doesn't stop there. There were three causes for the weakness of democracies, and that was now called appeasement. The democracies had a deep-seated fear of war. Number one. Number two, they feared communism more than they feared Germany. And finally, number three, they believed Hitler was an honorable man who could be trusted. Yeah. At the Munich conference, Hitler said, I have no more territorial demands. I'm good. I'm going to stop. Yeah, he did not stop because after Munich, it was too late. He had their trust. And in March of 1939, Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia inspired France and Britain to ask the Soviet Union for help. But Hitler and Stalin were already negotiating, in secret of course, the Nazi-Soviet pact, in which the countries agreed to divide Poland between them. And on September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. 3 days later, Britain would respond with bombing raids over Germany. We're going to stop there for today. Send me an email if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a great night, guys. Cheers.